Okay, so we were stressing the importance of these introductory matters. Why it's going to help us when we go to study the book of Mark, as we plan to look at Mark first, but as we study the actual text of the Gospels, why these introductory matters are important. And I went over all the different areas we're going to explore. And we wanted to understand the value of this kind of lengthy introductory materials and the weightiness of studying the Gospels. So that's what we dealt with, some of that last time. And I am adding something here that wasn't on the slide last Wednesday here. But when we said, as part of this understanding of the importance of Gospel accounts, they show us, we said, that Christ is the culmination of all of history and of all that we find in the Hebrew Bible and all that God was working through the ages for in the nation of Israel to prepare the world for the coming of Christ, and that all the Scriptures are about Him. Well, as I pointed out, what we're saying when we say all that is we need to treat them in their canonical context. That is, the context of the canon of Scripture. That is, not just pick them up and read them in isolation, but understand where they are in the big story of Scripture. And I think that the more we understand the Old Testament, would you not agree with this from the study we've already had through the Old Testament and your own study through the Old Testament? The more we're familiar with the Old Testament, I don't mean just the stories in the Old Testament, but the connected Bible story and the themes we find unfolding in the Old Testament narrative. The more familiar we are with that, the better we can read the Gospels. The more excited we'll be by what we find in the Gospels, the more we can appreciate them, the more we can understand them, and therefore the greater impact God can have on us through them. So all the other things we're studying too are helping us to understand and appreciate the Gospel. Just keep that in mind. So I wanted to add that language to that. So we said we need to understand, this is where we left off, what type of literature are the Gospels, and why pause to even consider this? Well, the reason it's important is when we go to read the text, our understanding of what it is will shape what we expect to find and how we interpret it. And I can give you a personal example. I like reading Holocaust survivor literature, and I have a lot of books from Holocaust survivors giving accounts of their ordeals. And some of them are collections from different individuals, and I was reading through one called Anton the Dove Fancier, and they were pretty short little chapters, and I was reading about things happening to all these different people, and I think I was about halfway through the book or so before I realized this was the same writer, and these were all just different vignettes in his own personal experience, and it wasn't a collection from different people. And all of a sudden, when I realized that it was autobiographical and that it was a single author and that it was unified, I had to stop and go back and rethink what I had read and sort of link things together, and it gave me a different understanding of what was happening. And really, it completely changed and deepened the poignancy of the whole thing to me. And you can think of examples along those lines too. Like we said, if you're reading something that starts once upon a time, then you know you're looking at a fairy tale and you're not expecting a historical account of actual events. So those are the type of things we said. Well, are the Gospels just stories? And when we say story, does that mean like a historical novel? Like you might read a novel about George Washington that is based on real events in his life, but is filled with conjecture and invented stories of conversations he had and interactions that he had with people and such. Well, we've addressed that, and we're going to address that. Are they biographies? And if so, would they be in the category of in the time in which they were written, of ancient biographies, or what are called bioi, the plural for bios, the word for life? Some say that's what they are. They're ancient biographies. That's how we should read them. They tell us about the life of Christ, and so obviously that's how we should read them. And many people pick them up and they read them like modern biographies. And modern biographies are much different different in key respects from ancient biographies. But here's why this matters. When we pick up a biography today, and you're going to read about Lincoln or Reagan or Obama or some American president or what have you. Now, typically, when you're reading a biography in the modern context, it's going to take us through that person's life, right, going all the way back to the person's roots and his upbringing, and then it's going to address the major issues and events and people in their lives, and will frequently talk about the person's own motivations and evaluations. We'll have all kinds of things along that line, and typically they'll be in chronological order. And I think that's what causes some people to stumble when they pick up Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and especially when they start comparing them, and it can get confusifying when we realize, wait a minute, this doesn't seem like in chronological order. Why wouldn't it be in the order of events that happen in Jesus' life? Why would you tinker with the order of events? It seems like you're reading this happen, and then you turn the page, and then you read the next chapter, and the next thing happened, and the next thing. But then when you realize that's not always what's happening, that can be a little bit of a stumbling point. Well, here's the sense in which they're not like reading the Gospels is not like reading a modern biography. First of all, they're not comprehensive, right? They don't tell us anything about Jesus' childhood. Virtually nothing. What's the one story we have about Jesus as a boy? When he's 12 years old in the temple, right? And even that, there's just very little detail about that. It's fascinating, though, right? And people have been fascinated with the boyhood of Jesus, and so there have been apocryphal stories. There have been these inventions, these fantastical accounts about things Jesus did as a child. I talked about that in the Sunday night sermon recently. They don't tell us about his personality. We get insights into his personality, but there's no description about Jesus' sense of humor, or this is the kind of mood that he had, or nothing like that as far as his internal motivation or personality. And we can get ideas from it, but there's no descriptions of that. And what's especially striking, no discussion whatsoever of his physical appearance. Wouldn't you like to know what Jesus looked like? People are intrigued. People are fascinated with trying to figure out what Jesus might have looked like. The Shroud of Turin, you see efforts to reconstruct the face of Jesus from what is allegedly the burial shroud that was used to cover the body of the Lord. People have these images, and it's one of the, I think, evidences of the credibility of the Gospels is that they don't stoop to satisfy all those curiosities that we would want if we were writing, maybe if we were setting up a biography of the Lord. They're also, as we said, not concerned with chronology like we would be. Another thing, when you read biographies today, you don't see what you do in the Gospels. The Gospels have a combination of genres. There's all these different types of literature inside the Gospel accounts, genealogies, there are hymns, speeches, sermons, miracle stories, pronouncement or announcement stories, all kinds of genres. But here's an important point as well, that when you read them, there's no pretense of neutrality. They're not claiming to just be objective accounts in the sense, now here's what I mean. They are objective as far as giving us the facts of what happened, but they're not disinterested parties, just like a journalist who goes and learns about a person and writes a story and doesn't have an interest in what you really believe or think about that person, or doesn't have an opinion himself about that person. They're not claiming that at all. They have a specific point of view that they are trying to convey about Christ, and that is different from if you pick up say a history book and you're going to just read a text, a history textbook, and go through, let's say, the era of Reconstruction, or you're going to look at the presidency of Truman or something like that. there is a definite point of view being conveyed that we will address as we continue. So we need to expect that. Now, here, and that wasn't just backtracking. We added there some things I needed to include so that weren't in the class Wednesday. So here's what we said, though. Really, this is what you have when we talk about a gospel. What is a gospel? They're historical narratives motivated by theological concerns. That's a good way to approach them. So let's look at each of these ideas. Their history, their narrative, and their theology. Each of these is important. Their history in the sense that they first of all, they have a history of composition. They went through stages. The life of Christ, we learned from Luke, there were people recording and reporting what happened in the life of Jesus, and Luke studies all that and brings it all together, and you finally arrive at his gospel, at his account. It appears he used Mark. We'll talk about that in another class. They have this whole history of how we got them, which is relevant to understanding the form in which we have them today, and there are some critical textual questions that come up along that line, especially about John chapter 8 and the ending of the book of Mark. They're set in a particular time and place, and especially Luke is concerned with giving us the geographical and political and historical details that nail down in Luke and in Acts exactly who was reigning and when, so that these are not reading like a mythological account. They're set in real place and time, and they're meant to recount actual events that really happen, and that's critical to our faith. And that's exactly what Luke says in Luke 1 through 4. Listen what Luke says. We're going to look at his prologue several times as we go through our introduction to the Gospels, but he says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us." So we're going to be looking at this idea later that, the Gospels we have here aren't the only stories we have about Jesus. Notice he said there are many people who have been writing about Christ and compiling a record of his life. But he said, verse 2, "Just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses." See, they saw these things, and they were ministers of the word, have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have the certainty concerning the things you have been taught. Notice Luke says that he followed all things closely. So he did his research. He was a careful historian. And he wanted Theophilus, by the way, that's all one sentence. And it is a brilliant sentence in Greek. And my Greek professor at Amherst, Dr. Smeal, who's a Vanderbilt linguist, PhD, world-class linguist, and he said that may very well be the greatest sentence ever written in the Greek language. It's the eloquence of that sentence is stunning in the original language. It's very wordy in English to try to read through it. But notice, we want you to be sure that about these things, the truth of these things. John says in John 19, look at verse 35 here. He says, "Now, he who saw it," see, he's an eyewitness of it, "I've borne witness." And he says his testimony is true. He's speaking about himself. And he knows, those are key words in John, truth, knowledge, knowing. And he knows he's telling the truth. Why? That you may also believe. See, they're written to show us we can have confidence in these accounts. We know they're reliable. We can know that they're true. We'll talk later about this movement over the last century to find the historical Jesus, the quest for the historical Jesus. Anyone heard that term before or seen a documentary? A lot of times around Easter, you'll see magazines on display at the counter in the grocery store. Or you'll see documentaries on A&E or National Geographic Channel or different channels. Who's the real Jesus? The quest to find the real Jesus. What really was Jesus? And what this is about is, well, what can we take from the Gospels? What can we dismiss as myth and things that Jesus probably didn't really say and do, and what things are actually reliable that we can say, well, this much we know. We know that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate and things of that nature. And there's this idea to separate the historical Jesus from the Jesus of faith, as he's called. But those two are connected in the Gospels. The Jesus of faith, the Jesus in whom we believe, is based on the historical reliability of the accounts about him. This is actual history of what really happened. But you'll hear a lot, we'll talk about this later, especially when we get to the resurrection, because this will be important. We can actually, there's a value to us. We can actually appeal to some of the secular approaches, this purely historical approach to the gospel records and to the life of Jesus, where those who don't even believe that Jesus really is the Son of God will admit that there are certain things you can know from the gospel accounts really did happen, and we can take those and use those to establish the truthfulness of what the Bible's saying about Christ, and especially about his resurrection. That'll be a fascinating study when we get to that point about the credibility of the Gospels, and especially about the resurrection, and that might be where we'll finally introduce that. But this is very distinctive. We want to emphasize this. It's very distinctive about Christianity. Unlike other religions that might be based on ideas, philosophies, like Eastern mysticism and ideas of what is ultimate reality and becoming one with the universe, and just philosophies, ideologies, or moralisms, or lists of teachings. This is about what God did in history, and our faith stands or falls on whether or not what we read in the Gospels is actually true. So they are history. That's very important to understand. But they're also stories. They're also narratives. So we said the Gospels are history, they're narrative, number two. And that means we need to avoid the tendency to sort of isolate pericopes. That means an individual account of something, like, say, Jesus talking to the woman at the well. That's a pericope. A lot of times there's a tendency to just study those things in isolation. Well, sure, we'll have a sermon, and we'll talk about Jesus' temptation by the devil in the wilderness, maybe look at an individual episode in the life of Christ, his encounter with the rich young ruler, or what have you. But sometimes in scholarship, there's a tendency to sort of isolate those or put them together and make one account out of the several different ones in the synoptics, and then you lose the whole flow of the narrative of the story. They have, like all stories, they have a plot that is being set out before the reader. There are settings and plot and characters. For example, the plot in Mark has the most emphasis on the passion narrative. He gets very quickly to Jesus' crucifixion and proportionally spends the most amount of time on that. All four of the accounts are really emphasizing the passion narrative, but especially Mark. The characters are different in Mark. In Mark, does anyone know how Mark portrays the disciples in comparison to Matthew, Luke, and John? In Mark, there's a much more negative characterization. They never understand what Jesus is saying. They're puzzled. They're confused. They're afraid to ask questions. Whereas Matthew and Luke kind of smooth that over and give us a little bit more balanced view. Mark has this view of, and really it's because when you're reading his gospel, it's leading up to a climax, and there's this tremendous irony where after the disciples through the whole book, Mark has what's called the messianic secret, where Jesus keeps telling him, don't tell him I'm the Messiah. Why did he keep telling him, tell no man I'm the Messiah? Didn't he want them to tell everyone that he's the Messiah? They didn't understand. They didn't properly understand Messiah and the mission of the Messiah to be entrusted at that point to be pointing out Jesus as the Messiah. So they don't understand through the whole gospel, and then when Jesus is crucified on the cross, who's the one who understands? The Roman soldier standing there. Truly, this was the Son of God. It becomes all the more climactic, and the impact of it is all the more powerful because Mark keeps showing, Jesus' own disciples didn't get it. But yet, if you looked at it from this Roman soldier's point of view, if you just come to it like he did, you will see this man is the Son of God. Peter confesses it. There's another climax in the book. He confesses it, but he doesn't understand it. And the Roman soldier doesn't understand all that's involved with it. But the characters are presented differently. The story develops differently, so we need to read them as individual stories, and we'll say more about that later. But they're not only narratives, or historical, rather, and narratives, but they're also theology. They have a specific theological purpose. Like Luke, we just saw in Luke. Luke is trying to assure this man, Theophilus, who appears to be a believer. So it appears that Luke is writing to believers to convict them, to make sure he said, I want you to be able to know the certainty of the things that you've heard. He wants believers to be convicted so that they can know that what they believe about Jesus really happened. So there's this idea of assuring believers and then persuading unbelievers, right? Doesn't John say, this is why I'm writing? You get to the end of the book of John, John 20, 30, and 31. Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. Try to watch this on double speed on YouTube. But these are written so that you may believe Jesus is the Christ. Why did John say he was writing? So that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And he wants you to believe so that you might have life in his name, another key word in the book of John, key concept in John's gospel. So John is writing with a specific theological purpose. He wants you to believe Jesus is the Christ so that you can have eternal life in his name. And so that's a critical point to keep in view as well. Let me go back to... and that's, by the way, why, I want to add this, and we already pointed out in John 19:35, he said, I'm a witness of these things so you can know what I'm saying is true. I saw it myself. All right, that's a lot different than saying, well, I heard it from someone, and this could be true, and this is what I believe, and so let me just share with you my own. No, he say, I saw it, I know it's true, and I'm telling it to you so that you can know that it's true. And so that's why we call them evangelists, right? The Gospels are called the four evangelists. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are referred to that way from the euangelistes, that word that means, that's the Greek term, and the verb euangelizo, to proclaim good news, a proclaimer of good news, because they're presenting the good news. Notice we call them the Gospels, plural. There's only one gospel, right? Galatians 1, 6 through 8. Paul said there's only one gospel, the gospel he preached. Anybody preaches another gospel, let him be accursed. There's one gospel, but these are gospels. Sometimes you'll see the gospel according to Matthew, the gospel according to Mark, meaning you're getting the perspective of those who are proclaiming the good news. So they are to convert. They have an evangelistic purpose. So that's the type of literature they are. And does anyone have a question or comment on that before we leave that? I know I rushed through that, but I want to get to this next part here before we run out of time. I need to take a breath. Question or comment? Wow, so we covered it that well, huh? Anyone with me? Is anyone freezing now at this point? Starting to lose circulation in your toes, maybe? Whoops, let me get rid of the dots. Okay, let me turn that air off. Let me get rid of the dots. There, yeah, just bump it up. Just hit the up arrow to 72. All right, so we've got 5 minutes to explore this very, very interesting question. Why do we have 4 different Gospels instead of just one? And I'll give you a chance here, I hope, in a minute to give some feedback. Why not just one story? There have been attempts made to take the different accounts and synthesize them into one story. The Diatessaron by Tatian back in the late 2nd century is really the earliest, most well-known attempt to try to synthesize the Gospels and just make one running account, which is highly problematic. When you try to do that, you end up having to leave things out and add things to fill in gaps. It's really a challenging enterprise to to try to do what Tatian did with that. And I know you can buy Harmonies of the Gospels. I have one. But why didn't God just give us one story? Why do we have these 4 accounts, and especially the synoptics? Does anyone know what synoptic means? Why Matthew are called the synoptics? Yeah, you can see in that optics, seeing, and sin the same. It means to see the same. They're called the synoptics because they're so similar. When you read them, there are long sections that are almost identical. Why? Why do we need that kind of repetition? Now, when you read John, you get to John, almost 90% new material. Look, when you read Mark, for example, you might think, why do we need the book of Mark? 90% of what's in Mark is found in Matthew and Luke. Almost all of it. Now, when you get to John, I can understand why you might have Matthew and say the book of John. When you get to John, it's almost none of what is in the synoptics is in John. 90% new material, of course, the crucifixion and the resurrection. But you get to John and it's almost all entirely new material. But why the synoptics? Why Matthew, Mark, and Luke? You have so much similarity there. But when you look more closely at them, we've still got 3 minutes. There are key differences. There are differences in geographical direction. For example, Luke's gospel is more concerned about Jerusalem than Mark. So you have Galilee versus Mark's more concerned about Galilee, and Luke is more concerned about Jesus in Jerusalem. But in John, you have a lot of movement in and out from Galilee to Jerusalem, Galilee to Jerusalem. So it's different in that respect. Jesus' style of teaching is presented differently in each gospel. And the content of Jesus' teaching is different in each of the gospels. And so there are very important reasons for having 4 different accounts. There are historical reasons. They were written with different original audiences in mind. They were all written for everyone of all ages, including you and me. But originally, as we often point out, and I'm going to talk about this in the sermon this morning, Matthew had in mind the Jewish audience, and so he quotes from the Old Testament the most, and he has a special interest in showing Jesus teaching about the law and the relationship of the Christian to the law, and Jesus as the fulfillment of the law, because Torah was the big concept in the mind of the Jew, and he's trying to show Jesus as the Messiah. So you have historical reasons. John writes much later than the others, and his gospel is much more abstract and philosophical and theological. And some think, that was because he's in a different setting, more influenced by Greek thought and that sort of thing. But there are important theological reasons, because they give us distinctive portraits of Christ that, again, I'm going to talk about that in the sermon this morning, and we'll go over it a little bit in class. But and some have suggested by giving us 4 Gospels, God has addressed every category of person in the world. Now, I'm not saying this is necessarily the case, but it's interesting to contemplate that Matthew had in mind the Jewish believer to confirm that Jesus really is the Messiah. Mark is writing to a Gentile audience and those who don't believe, whereas Luke, you see, Luke is a Gentile himself, and he's writing to Theophilus, who apparently is a believer or seems to be a Christian. And so you have those different categories. And then John, even though John's gospel is sometimes considered the one that's for everyone, that it is a very Jewish gospel in certain respects, and so some think that he's trying to convince the Jewish unbeliever. But what we should realize is there's tremendous value in having this unity and diversity, having these different perspectives of who Jesus is. It gives us a richer image of Christ. There's only one Lord, but there's a great value in having these 4 perspectives, and we'll talk about that and how the early church understood these 4 perspectives about Christ as represented in the characters associated with each gospel, the animals from the man and the animals, excuse me, from Ezekiel 1 and Revelation chapter 4. But let me finish with this. Think of it this way, that when we see light just through our unaided eye, we may not realize all the spectrum of colors that's involved in white light. But when a prism breaks it up, we can see a beauty in each individual element that makes up the spectrum of light that we behold. And the Gospels do that for us. They present Christ with these distinctive and distinctly beautiful and stunning and impressive portraits of Jesus. They give us these highly individualistic pictures that all harmonize and come together to form our image of who Jesus is. So we're gonna talk about why 4 Gospels, and then and why only 4 Gospels next time, and then we'll start to get into how they were composed, which is very interesting and I think important as well. So I hope this is helpful to you. Thank you for your good attention this morning.